Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're continuing along with Motor City Drama by Russell Lee Durant, a fictional history of the automotive industry, going behind the scenes, building the big three with Ford, Durant, and Chrysler. Today we're talking about Chapter 5, Billy Durant's Road Back to Power. And something that I actually wrote about in the last blog post that I did, which came out last week, and explaining kind of how Billy Durant ended up coming back to General Motors and taking back the presidency and becoming president of GM after he was kind of ousted from GM. The reason that he was ousted was he got into some financial trouble. They had to get help from some banks. One of them was Boston based. I believe the other one was JP Morgan related. And they needed basically loans to keep GM afloat. Now, the stipulation for getting that money was that Billy Durant would step down from his operational control position, which was replaced by a voting trust. So where Billy Durant just had one vote amongst a group of, I believe it was 5. And eventually, Billy Durant gets kind of forced out this way, that he doesn't have operational control like he used to at GM. But he ends up fighting back. And if you check out that blog post, we kind of go into that on how he ended up using Chevrolet, buying shares on the open market on Wall Street with the help of Pierre DuPont, which is another tech, not a tech, an industrial entrepreneur at this time, buying up shares to the point where Chevrolet then owned a controlling stake in GM. So that was a very interesting story. We're going to kind of talk about it here in Chapter 5. Let's go to the first slide. But we're going to mostly, there we go, talk about Louis Chevrolet. And Russell starts off the chapter talking about Louis Chevrolet, who was born in Switzerland, grew up in France, and he's got a brother, Arthur, who were a part of the race team at Buick. Racing's like a huge deal back in this time. We saw that with Henry Ford and him trying to get a race car, up and started, and here we have Louis Chevrolet and his brother. They want to join GM and the race team over at Buick, which they end up doing. Eventually, Chevrolet leaves Buick in 1909, but then in 1911, they meet back up again because Louis got an idea for a new car company. And Billy, just having kind of been ousted from having his operational control at GM, he's thinking, oh, why not? I kind of don't got anything else to do now. Well, he still kind of does, but, why not help jumpstart another car company? So Chevrolet Motor Company ends up getting incorporated. And there is a conversation that Billy and Louis Chevrolet have, and Russell writes it here on page 24. Louis contacted Billy again in 1911 and set up a meeting with him at a local restaurant. At this time, Billy was serving as one of 5 directors of General Motors, having been removed as president. Louis opened the conversation. Billy, I want to start a car company. My name has a lot of recognition because of my racing success. I don't know much about business, so that's why I'm talking to you. Maybe we could work together. What do you think? And now this is Billy, quote, you hit me at a good time. I'm kind of bored being just a director at GM. I've always thought that GM should build a smaller, less expensive car to compete with Henry Ford. This is going to be key later on in a few years between Chevrolet and Billy Durant. Look at the success he has had with the Model N, but my board always turned me down. They like the profit margins of the big models. So let's talk more. And they did. Billy incorporated Chevrolet Motor Company in 1911 while still director at GM. Louis got 100 shares of stock in the new company. Their first plant was in Detroit, and Billy and his family moved there in 1912. It's kind of where some problems started, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So, first plant gets founded in Detroit. Early Chevrolet cars had some unique innovations in that they had a self-starter, electric lights, and a 3-speed clutch instead of the Ford model, which had the 2-pedal planetary design. So continuing forward with this whole story on Billy Durant, Billy gets a supplier company in a very similar fashion, how Ford was able to found his own supplier company, Ford Manufacturing Company, and then selling parts from Ford Manufacturing Company to Ford Motor Company. Because again, remember, Henry Ford didn't own 100% of Ford Motor Company. That was a conglomerate that came together, headed by Alexander Malcolmson, who helped to back Henry Ford in starting his third automotive company venture. But the Ford Manufacturing Company was his own thing. When Billy was president of GM, he purchased the AC Spark Plug Company. And in 1916, Durant formed United Motors, which was, again, a collection of 5 parts manufacturers. And what he's going to end up doing is Al Sloan, which was one of the presidents of one of those parts companies that merged into United Motors, or let me see here. If it wasn't United Motors, it was one of the parts companies that GM had kind of brought on board. And that company was Hyatt Roller Bearings. Yeah, one of the companies that merged into GM. There you go. I have it right there in a bullet point. Billy asks Al to step down from Hyatt in order to run United Motors. And this gentleman, Al Sloan, is going to be a huge name at GM. He's eventually going to take over as president of GM. I do believe. I'm pretty sure on that. I haven't read that far yet in the history books. But I'm pretty sure he ends up taking over. And let's go to the next slide, where Billy takes back GM. So in the spring of 1916, Billy has a conversation with Louis on taking over GM again, and Louis kind of a little bit skeptical. But Billy kind of shares the plan with him. Okay, so here's what they're going to do. They're going to offer 5 shares of Chevy for 1 share of General Motors. Billy goes to the board at Chevrolet, and they get this whole action approved. GM stockholders started trading in their shares in high numbers, and Chevy ends up gaining the majority controlling interest in GM. Not without the help of Pierre DuPont as well, who is buying shares in GM. And Pierre DuPont, according to Russell, was the one that kind of convinced Billy Durant to keep GM as the main entity. Because remember, Chevy ends up controlling GM, but it's almost like, hey, let's flip this around. We want the Chevrolet name inside of GM. We want GM to be the parent company, essentially. But like in the case here, it almost seemed like Chevrolet was going to become the parent company, And eventually, this is kind of how Billy comes back as president. This is kind of a brief overview of her, but if you wanted a little bit more of a detail on it, I'll put a link to that blog post that I did in the description. So Russell outlines this conversation that's had between Louis and Billy on his whole scheme to come back at GM. So Billy Durant says, Louis, quote, I want to fill you in on my latest plan. I plan to take over GM. And I could kind of assume here that Louis kind of thinking like, what are you crazy? Like, dude, you want to go back to GM again? He says, really, Billy? You are a real dreamer, but this sounds like a pipe dream. Take over GM. You and what army? And then Billy says, quote, no army needed, just paper. We'll offer to trade 5 shares of Chevrolet stock for every share of GM stock. At some point, if things go as I think, Chevrolet will hold the majority of shares of GM stock and we can take over. I wanted to tell you this today before tomorrow's Chevrolet board meeting where I will ask for approval of this plan. As a Chevrolet stockholder, I want your vote. What do you think? And Louis ends up agreeing with it. Here in the next line that Russell writes, Louis stood up. I think you are crazy, Billy. Crazy like a fox. Let's go for it. So it's interesting. I could totally see how that was like the actual conversation that played out there. I think you're crazy, but what the hell? Let's do it. So who's Charles Nash? Well, after Billy is removed from that role at GM, Charles Nash becomes the president of GM for a certain time. But when Billy comes back to being president, and there was another president before Charlie Nash. I forget the exact name, but there was somebody else. Then Charles Nash, I think, comes in later because Charles Nash was the one that appointed. Charles Nash used to be just the president of Buick. He ends up appointing Walter Chrysler, then president of Buick, because he's going to be the president of GM. So Charles Nash enters the picture. When Billy comes back, he leaves GM, and now he takes over a automobile company in Kenosha, Wisconsin, Thomas Jeffrey Automobile Company, and they rename it to Nash Motors. And now Walter Chrysler, who's had some success in the Buick division, and again, he's the one that appointed him to be president of Buick. He wants to take Walter Chrysler with him. But Billy says, oh, no. He's going to show up in Flint. I think at this time he's in New York, I believe. Yes, he was living in New York. He takes a night train to Flint because he's like, oh my gosh, I got to get over there as quick as I can because I can't let this happen. And he makes Walter the offer of a lifetime, $500,000 a year salary to stay as president of Buick. The only catch here is that Walter asks for complete control. He wants to be the final decision maker. He doesn't want any interference. And they agree to the deal. Next up in Russell's story here, we flash forward to the New York Auto Show where Durant meets back up with Henry Ford. Now these two tycoons, they're, decently both successful now. And they're having a conversation. Even though they didn't join forces together, like almost happened, they're both doing very well. And there's a conversation that happens that Russell kind of writes about and surmises this is kind of how a conversation would go between these two. Henry took a sip of his lemonade and then commented, and you are doing very well with it, and I am quite impressed with how you got back the presidency of GM. I guess we are the two big dogs in the fight. And the American people are the winners in this fight. I always wanted a car for the common man, which I gave them, and now they have two. Do you realize that we are changing American society? People can travel to where the work is and to see family and to vacation. We finally have replaced the horse and buggy for good. And then Billy chimes in and made a good buck in doing it, I must say. And then Henry Ford continues, quote, Billy, I understand that you folks are building a huge new headquarters on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit. That takes a lot of bucks, and they're calling it the Durant building, even putting your initial D in the top, in each top corner. And then Billy eventually says, yes, that is the board's idea. Some of us wonder if it isn't too big. They feel we will grow into it eventually, and they say that I am the dreamer. Well, I have a dinner to get to with some suppliers, so I better get along. Good to see you again. I never have quite gotten over the fact that we could not get you into GM, but it looks like it worked out better for you by going your own way. Best of luck to you. I feel that having a good competitor makes us both stronger. I guess that is true. Just don't get too strong. I kind of like the idea of being number one. So that's kind of like the fictional conversation that Billy and Henry would have. And like I said, the problems just don't stop for Billy Durant. You know, he's got the financial issues. Him and Louis Chevrolet are going to get into it at some point. And him and Walter are going to get into it again at some point. Because Billy Durant's been undercutting Walter's decisions. And again, that was kind of the stipulation for Walter sticking around, was that wouldn't happen. But in 1919, that's when the final straw comes, because Walter is in negotiations with this company, A.O. Smith Company, to build Buick frames there. Now, A.O. Smith Company is outside of Michigan, I believe. Okay, yeah, it was in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But instead, Durant goes behind his back and gets approved to build a brand new plant in Flint that they're going to manufacture the frames out of that plant. Billy wants to keep those jobs in Flint for the people of Flint. He wants to keep supporting the town. But Walter comes in and is kind of upset. I mean, and, you know, understandably so. You know, Flint's such a big... There's only so much space in Flint. There's no room for the additional workers to hire on to work at this plant. Plus, the plant's going to take 2 years to build. They need the frames now. The A.O. Smith Company is already, you know, up and operational. It's already doing its thing. And they need them now. They can't wait 2 years. So what ends up happening is, at a GM board meeting, Walter raises the same concerns. And he warns Billy about this, as Russell kind of outlines in the story. He's like, Walter says to Billy, hey, I'm going to tell the board exactly what I'm telling you right now. I'm kind of not going to be shy about it. So he does. He does. And what does the board say? The plant was never built in Flint, and the frames were purchased from A.O. Smith. Walter knew this strong opposition would not sit well with Billy, but at this point he didn't care. His 3 years were about up, and he leaves GM shortly. Sells a stock, gets $10 million for it, and now Walter's out at GM. But as his name suggests, he's not down and out for the count in the automobile industry. We will pick back up with Walter's story later on. So a bit about Chevrolet, like we talked about. Louis was this race car driver, came to the United States from overseas, again, Swiss, grew up in France. 1905, he's starting to get a pretty good reputation as a pretty fast driver, pretty good driver. And those Chevy brothers want to join GM, join that Buick racing team. But it's funny because, as the story goes, Billy has Louis and Arthur race against each other, I think is how the story went. He ends up hiring Louis for the racing team, but Arthur to be his personal chauffeur, because he saw how carefully Arthur drove and said, oh, I need that careful driver to get me around from place to place. But Louis is highly successful. Buick wins about half of all races in the U.S. between 1908 and 1911. He eventually leaves Buick to become a free agent. And not just that, he has this idea for a new car, which will take on his name. And on November 3rd, 1911, they make this happen. Him and Billy Durant hook up again, and they incorporate Chevrolet. With the headquarters being in Detroit, Louis gets provided 100 shares of Chevrolet stock, plus he gives up the use of his name in the company. And then there you see the other incorporators, Bill Little, Dr. Edwin R. Campbell, Billy Durant as well. And all this is, again, happening after the voting trust gets established at GM. In addition to Chevrolet, Billy Durant starts buying up these other companies. So he buys out Flint Wagon Works in order to convert it into a car production facility. He starts Republic Motors, Mason Motor Car Company, Little Motor Car Company. And what he's really trying to do here was to build Chevrolet. No, and I spelled Chevrolet wrong there. Build Chevrolet cars in Detroit and Flint using Mason Motor and Little Motor Car Company. So the already established factories, he's buying them out to help with the production of Chevrolet cars instead of, just kind of building brand new plants. Buy out these companies and use their existing plants, as well as he's going to leverage buying plants across the United States. And he's not going to just sit in Michigan. We're going to see that in a second here. But again, Louis ends up getting a little bit upset. I can kind of see that, based on what we were just talking about with the Walter Chrysler situation. Billy wants things his way. And there is a disagreement over the type of car that should be built at Chevrolet. Louis wanted a larger, more elegant car, and like we saw in the conversation that Russell kind of fictionalizes, Billy wants a car that can compete with the smaller Model N. I mean, in this case, from what I read from one of the books, one of the history books on Billy Durant, Billy wanted a car that would compete with the Model T. So something smaller is what I'm guessing here. And it's funny, there's this incident, this cigarette incident with Billy and Louis Chevrolet, where Billy told Louis, who smokes cigarettes, he told him to stop smoking cigarettes and switch to cigars because cigars are more becoming of a automotive CEO, not a CEO, but an automotive like executive. Yeah. And cigarettes are kind of more feminine. They don't look good in a man's mouth. Well, Louis is kind of fed up with the direction. The cigarette incident, I don't think, helped at all. And Louis ends up selling his shares to Durant for $10,000. He ends up returning to racing. He's going to have still, a decent life. And Chevrolet ends up launching its first cars starting in 1913 with two brands or two models, the Royal Mail and the Baby Grand. And then after that, trying to build on top of that, the Chevrolet releases the 490, which was meant to be the price, $490, but it ends up being actually $550. And like I said earlier, they kind of run into a production problem because the automotive industry starts booming and they can't keep up. So now Billy Durant leverages this nationwide manufacturing network. And this is the role of Republic Motors that he helps establish, where they are leasing plants in different parts of the country to be involved in the production of his cars instead of trying to keep everything in Michigan. And that's kind of like the main difference here, at the beginning at least, between GM and Ford, with Ford having all of its production there in Michigan. GM is going to branch out, or Chevrolet, is going to branch out, and they're going to leverage all these plants across the country. So two really good books on Billy Durant here. One by Lawrence Wright Gustin, and the other one by William Pelfrey. Those are the names of them right there. Very cool books on the story of Billy Durant. And guys, that's going to do it for this episode of Chee-Tash. Thank you so much for listening. I know I didn't have a video today. I didn't, you guys don't want to see me, my pretty face. You want this information. No, I'll be back on video next time. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. We'll be back with Chapter 6 next week of Motor City Drama. We are going to be going back to the little bit of Dodge Brothers next time, so stay tuned. Hope you guys have been enjoying this automotive history and Russell Lee DeRay's book, which really brings some of these conversations and scenes from this time, brings them alive. And I highly, highly recommend his book, Motor City Drama. Again, link to the book in the description of the video. And that's going to do it. Guys, my name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.